What is going on, y'all? Sam Wilson is out. Let's take a look at some of the top decks using Marvel Snap's newest season pass card. But first, let's take a look at the synergies that Sam Wilson has and the directions people are going in terms of building around the card. Sam Wilson is a 2/3 with an ongoing ability and a game start ability. His game start ability adds Cap's shield to the board on turn 0 effectively, starting the game with a 1/1 on the board. His ongoing ability allows you to move that shield around the board once per turn. The shield itself is a 1/1 with an ability that says this can't be destroyed. It also has an additional ability that it gives Cap +2 power when it moves to its location. This cap applies to both Sam Wilson and Steve Rogers, as both are Captain America. In terms of things people are using with Sam Wilson, I think it's best to start with the most obvious, which is Captain America Steve Rogers. And this, of course, has some baseline synergy just starting out with, even if you don't draw Sam Wilson, Captain America likes you to have full lanes of ongoing cards, and the ongoing ability on Cap's shield does mean that it'll get a buff from Captain America. So even if you can't move it, as long as you put Captain America in its location, you'll still get pretty good value out of that free unit. Captain America and Sam Wilson can also throw the shield back and forth at each other. This is a very cool thing to actually have going. When you have a Sam Wilson down and a Captain America down, you can move the shield back and forth to them, giving them buffs each time you do. This also, interestingly, seems to work when Steve Rogers is face down, which it probably shouldn't. I would expect that to get patched out at some point soon. Cull Obsidian requires a 1-cost card to be on the board at the location that it's played at. Sam Wilson creates a 1-cost card, and it is, of course, also totally unable to be blown up by Killmonger. This means that, barring location shenanigans, you will always have a place to play your Cull Obsidian. This is a major overlap that does actually seriously benefit you, because always having that guaranteed is a big part of why Cull Obsidian is sort of costed the way that it is. This card is not meant to be an unconditional 4/10. The condition is meant to actually require a sacrifice. Sam Wilson says, no, actually it's pretty close to unconditional. Cap's shield has a similar dynamic with Attuma. Attuma destroys the weakest card, or not the weakest card, one of the cards that is weaker than him at his location, and one of the cards that is weaker than him is going to be Cap's shield, and it can't be destroyed. So that's a very useful thing to have access to. It's not going to mean you can always stack up a bunch of stuff on Attuma, but it does meaningfully mitigate his downside in some ways, and at least have the potential to do so in others. This is a much smaller synergy than it is with Cull Obsidian, but you will see it. Back onto ongoing synergy, there's a fairly obvious synergy built in with Spectrum, because both Cap's shield and Sam Wilson are ongoing cards, because you very often want to run Sam Wilson with Captain America, who is also ongoing, and because ongoing cards are generally not that good at actually filling up multiple lanes. A lot of Spectrum decks tend to look like decks that have 4 cards in one lane, and then 1 or 2 in another lane. Having the ability to more easily fill up that 4 lane, or to move stuff around and get an additional maybe 3 points somewhere else is very, very relevant. Spectrum is effectively just gaining power by this card existing. Having a guaranteed hit on turn 0 is very nice. A 2/3 that actually does good things is very nice. And the additional stacking of buffs between Sam Wilson and Steve Rogers means that you're going to be able to have more power at a baseline than this deck is actually used to having. Kraven the Hunter is not known for his MCU synergy with Captain America. In fact, he's not known for his MCU synergy at all. He's in the Sony universe with Madam Web and Morbius. These are not cards that interacted in any real way, as far as I know, in the comics or in the MCU, but in Marvel Snap, Kraven might be the best single card to pair with Sam Wilson Captain America, because it is effectively a second Captain America Steve Rogers, in that it gets a benefit from the shield moving to it of +2 power, and then you can repeatedly trigger that benefit over and over, chucking the shield back and forth between the lane that Sam Wilson is in and the lane that Kraven is in, making him a very large threat. This is also a card that notably costs less than Steve Rogers, and this is crucial too, has a more direct home. Kraven the Hunter is already being run in a variety of different Scream decks, which Steve Rogers fits into very well, just as a method of raising the floor of those decks and providing more busted early game draws. Sure, Maybe you aren't able to have Scream on 2 every time, but having Sam and Craven is a pretty damn good substitute. The last synergy piece I wanted to talk about here is Mockingbird. Mockingbird is a very unique card in that it is effectively getting a free discount from this happening. However, the downside is that Mockingbird wants your board to be full, but not too full, and that's kind of a risk that you have to run when you're playing stuff like her. This is a card that definitely has some synergy here. There's no world in which that isn't true, but if you're fully optimizing for Mockingbird with stuff like Thanos Stones and whatnot, you run the risk of getting your board too full to actually do much of anything. That's not a huge knock against it, and I still think there's more to explore here, but there are going to be far more decks that we talk about using the other synergies than there are using Mockingbird synergies. I just think it's worthwhile to point out that Sam does have some notable synergies here as well. Jumping into the decks, the first one is a deck that I have been highlighting for a very long time since I saw Sam Wilson and since I played it before Sam came out. I think this deck is honestly quite strong and is the deck that is the best positioned in the wake of Sam Wilson to take advantage of multiple things that it can do. This is a deck that is taking advantage not just of Sam Wilson's synergy with Kraven the Hunter, but also of Sam Wilson's synergy with Cull Obsidian in order to have as many of the most powerful scaling starts in Marvel Snap as you can possibly have. You have Scream, which is a +4 scaler. You have Sam and Craven, which is not necessarily +4, but over a certain amount of time, it's pretty damn good. You have, in addition to that, Surtur, which is a +3 scaler. So you have all of these cards that scale massively. You have reasonable amounts of disruption, although no dedicated tech cards. I was previously playing a Red Guardian in place of Polaris, which is much harder to justify in a world where everyone is playing Sam, because you just end up hitting the frickin' thing all the time, just bounces off Cap Shield and you feel stupid. But it's not the worst thing in the world to consider trying to get some tech in here. What this deck is doing ultimately is just stacking very good scalers in the early game into very good bodies in the late game. You have a bunch of big guys at the 4, 5, and 6, very strong guys, and in additional, very hard to play around guys. Imagine trying to play around a Magneto or a Heimdall. It's not easy. And so you have this baseline power of really strong scalers backed up by really big bodies, backed up by really big bodies that are also tricky. If I had to pick one deck in this video to say that this is probably the thing that's going to end up being around a lot, I think it would be this one, which I'm affectionately calling Synergies. I am going to pat myself on the back just a little bit for this, because this is a deck that I was playing before Sam came out, and it's almost exactly the kind of thing that I thought would be good after Sam came out. I have a friend who's ranked 3 right now with this exact deck climbing in infinite with it, not just beating up bots. I think there is some real upside to this kind of build right now. Another way to try to approach this is to use the Scream 2099 strategy. The theory here is the same, but a bit more diffuse, right? Like, you're taking the Scream deck, you're supplementing your Kraven game plans with Sam Wilson, and then you're picking whatever endgame you want. Your 4, 5, and 6s are still extremely good, but they're more spread out as opposed to going tall. And you lose the ability to scale with Surtur, but you gain the ability to scale with Doom 2099. These decks are very similar in ethos. The basic theory is the same, that Scream decks are a great place for Sam to go because they make Kraven less of a clear tier 2 option behind Scream and more of a 1B to her 1A. Sometimes even the 1A to her 1B, depending on what your endgame really starts to look like. Very powerful card, and I think that this is where we're using multiple parts of Sam Wilson very effectively. Skaar has been in a position where it didn't really have an early game because of the sacrifices it had to make in order to justify running cards like Cull Obsidian or Crossbones or Atuma. And now it's able to like sort of free that up just a little bit and run a couple of reasonable, decent cards, right? Like, we were previously in a world where it's like, do we want to run Iron Patriot or do we need that third 1-drop? We don't have to ask ourselves those questions anymore because Sam gives us that 1-drop for Cull Obsidian. Sam gives us that card that Atuma can destroy and not actually destroy. Sam lets us do a lot of powerful stuff in this deck. This is a very straightforward, very good deck that got better with the addition of Sam Wilson. This is also a card that is going to make this deck better in ways that are maybe not the most appreciable, right? Like, it's not doing anything incredibly active here. It's just freeing up slots in the deck to make the deck work better. This is like, I don't know how many people are going to notice, like, oh, I didn't have to stress about Cull Obsidian that game. I think once the stress is gone, you start to not notice or not remember how bad things used to be. You don't remember those games where you just like can't play Cull Obsidian. You're just sitting at it looking at your hand like, I can't play a card right now, or I can't put it in the lane I want to put it right now. That is so dead and gone. We are living in the future of this right now. We don't have to worry about that at all anymore, and that is a really, really big deal. Just raising the floor of a deck that already has a high floor. And I think that the floor is actually the real risk for this deck if you're going to talk about it like that. Because one of the things I've noticed about the way Marvel Snap does balance is that decks with high ceilings and low floors, like Move Bounce, take forever to get nerfed. But decks with low floors and high floors and low ceilings, stuff like Darkhawk famously like always gets nerfed. And I think this deck is pretty similar to that, where it's just like the difference between a good player playing this deck and a bad player playing this deck is actually pretty minimal, because it's really just going to be your ability to do turn 6 reads. And what's actually going to happen a lot of the time is when you get your nut draw, you're going to win against anything that nut draw would win against, no matter how good you are. And that is a real concern, I think. Like, if I'm worried about anything getting hit here, for the same reason I'm always sort of continually worried about Doom 2099 getting hit, like, the cards that have these high floors, I feel like, are so much more often targets for the balance team, because they're balancing for a wide range of people, while these cards that have low floors but high ceilings, like Madam Web, it takes forever for them to actually figure it out. I don't really like that, but I do think I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't point it out. And so there is some worry for me about this kind of stuff. This is a build from Ica, leaning into a couple of synergies that we haven't really explored with this card, which are basically the synergy with Marvel Boy. And I think that's a really unique one, where this is a card that cannot get Killmongered and will always carry Marvel Boy buffs. I don't know if this is the exact right way to do it. And I think the more you lean into Marvel Boy, the more you take your card that can't be Killmongered and make your deck vulnerable to Killmonger by stacking stuff up that does get Killmongered alongside it. I worry about this, but I do think it's interesting and worth pointing out. I also think that it's possible that this just ends up being one of the good 2-drops. You put it in Wiccan, it does what it does, and it's just a very good card in the context of Wiccan. That makes sense to me as well. I think that there's something to be said for trying to build around Marvel Boy, but ultimately my worry is that the more you build around Marvel Boy, the more you take a strength of this card, which is that it doesn't die to Killmonger, and you turn it into a weakness of your deck, which is that your deck then does die to Killmonger the more you try to be a Marvel Boy gamer. Let's talk about some ongoing builds. I think this is the best one that my friends have found so far. This is a very powerful, straightforward deck that just does stats. That's really it. We're just trying to do stats incredibly efficiently. We are very good at doing stats. There are not a lot of people playing Enchantress, even though I just showed a deck that had Enchantress in it. This is a deck that has numbers, and it has a lot of them. And that power level is something that we can use to try to catch people off guard. Some people don't tend to expect, like, final turn, Captain America, Mr. Fantastic, the Moonstone lane, stuff like that, where it's like, they might have expected the Mr. Fantastic, but the Captain America makes the lane go so much taller than they would have expected. Or maybe we have an Anti-Venom Spectrum or something like that to play. Just a bunch of powerful stuff that is unique and strong. Ultimately, though, this is the kind of deck that exists only so long as people are not playing the stuff that beats it. It exists only so long as people are not playing Enchantress. It exists only so long as Alioth has been on the downswing, because there are so many people playing Surtur decks. And I do think that's worth pointing out, right? Like, the more people play, like, these Surtur, Tens, Scream, Big Boy decks, the less Alioth you're going to see, because Alioth isn't good at swinging something back when you're behind. Alioth is a card that you play when you have momentum. It's not the kind of card that can face up to a free Skaar. You just can't beat that basically ever. And so we are in a metagame where it's like, okay, there actually is a lot of reason to not be playing Alioth. There's a lot of reason to not be playing Enchantress, because again, it's like, okay, why would I use that slot on Enchantress when I can use it on Shang-Chi? What are we doing here, right? And so this is the kind of deck that can exist right now. You can play a lot of ongoing stuff because other decks are covering for you, basically. Because these big boy Scream decks, these big boy Skaar decks, are punishing anyone who wants to actually have the answers to what you're doing. Like Alioth, like Enchantress. People want to be able to play those cards, but they can't, because they'll just get super punished by the other decks. So a deck like this can exist and even thrive in that context. I've also seen some ongoing 2099 decks. I get it. But these feel a lot more, I don't know what the right word is, not vulnerable, but a lot more like, this is all face up and you're not going to have good cube equity with a deck like this long term. Where maybe right now when people don't really get what's happening, you might be able to get them by like tricking them with Spectrum or Doom. They're like, oh, I don't know which one it's going to be kind of stuff. But there's not as much like ability to actually surprise your opponent here as there is in like an anti-venom deck, which has fundamentally infinite ability to surprise your opponent. Like it could be a lot of stuff they have to play around, whereas this is just going to be a lot of the time like, all right, let me math out what happens if they Doom. If I beat it, I'm going to win and win a bunch of cubes. And if I lose it, I'm going to retreat. It's a very face-up deck. Like, and there are issues with that long term. Those issues don't necessarily present when you're climbing against bots. Those issues don't necessarily present when you're playing early and people aren't used to the play patterns, but they will and can present in a long-term way. All right, y'all, thank you so much for watching the video. I have a couple of things to say at the end, the first of which is, I think Sam Wilson not necessarily got overhyped. I will say, I think I may have been a little high on him. Like, I included him in this group of cards, which is like Galacta, which is like Skaar, which is like Surtur, which is like Iron Patriot, and I don't know that it was fair to do so. That said, I do think he's strong, but I feel like he's, I'm trying to figure out the right way to say this. You know how Galacta is strong in a sort of abstract sense where she just goes in a bunch of stuff? And then how, like, Surtur and Skaar are strong in a very specific sense, but not very strong outside of that specific context. Sam Wilson is a card that is strong in a specific context, but probably not as strong as like Agent Venom or Surtur, right? Like that's really what I'm trying to get at. Like if those are 10s, then he is an 8 in that context. Like if we're talking about specifically cards that are strong in specific as opposed to cards that are strong in general, stuff like Iron Patriot, like Galacta. This is a card that I think is weaker than Surtur or Agent Venom, but still a pretty powerful card. And I worry that the association with those previous battle passes sort of got people's hopes up and like, this is the new Iron Patriot. And I want to be clear, I don't think it was ever going to be the new Iron Patriot, but I did think it could be in like Galacta range. And it's looking to me like he ends up being a little more specific than generic. Like he wants to be with specific stuff. He's not just like the kind of thing you run generically. He might make some of those packages the generically strongest thing to be doing in the game, but that's not really the same thing, right? Like that's like if Galacta only went in Silver Surfer. It would be a good success, but it wouldn't be the card that we're talking about here. And so I think ultimately he probably ends up coming in last of those 5, right? If we were listing out Agent Venom, Surtur, we're talking at release here, Galacta, and of course Iron Patriot, he's probably last. That's not to say he's bad. I think he's one of the better season passes that we've had in not in a while, but like objectively, I think he's probably on the top half of season pass cards that we've had, right? And I think it's sort of hard to look at this as like, oh, they're slipping in terms of this. It's just like, I don't really know how you top an Iron Patriot. Anything that comes after the card that's 40% of the metagame is going to feel like a letdown. But I do think he's probably worth picking up, if not because of him, then because if you are going to spend money, the Season Pass is extremely good value. Just remember, again, make sure you don't buy the premium Season Pass. Not worth it at all. Second thing I wanted to bring up. I know there are people who keep track of my outfits on these. I wanted to promise you, I'm not wearing the same shirt as yesterday. Different shirt. Same color, different shirt. I wanted everyone to know that, so no one flames me in the comments for being a dirty, gross gamer dude. I didn't notice it was the same color until I put it on and stood in front of the camera. I was like, wait, I wore this yesterday. And then I looked down at the ground, which I realized is not helping my case of being a dirty, gross gamer dude. And it was right there on the ground. And I was like, I'll prove it to you. And I realized I'm kind of digging myself a hole here. So I'm going to end the video right now. And we're not going to talk about this again. And I am not going to continue digging further.